In June 1944, while the world's attention was fixed on Normandy and the blood-soaked beaches of France, something far quieter, but no less explosive happened inside. A small stone church in southern England, a uniformed American army captain walked down the aisle, past wooden pews polished by centuries of hands, and issued an order that was never meant to be questioned. Black American soldiers were not to sit wherever they pleased. Segregation, he insisted, applied here too. What happened next shocked everyone involved, including the U.S. Army itself. The pastor refused, calmly, completely, and without apology. The service went on. The soldiers remained seated, and for the first time since crossing the Atlantic, men who had grown up under Jim Crow realized something unsettling. The rules that governed their entire lives were not universal. They were choices. These soldiers came from places where a glance held too long could end a life, where churches preached equality while enforcing separation, where dignity was something you learned to protect, quietly, because no one else would. They wore American uniforms. They had sworn an oath to defend freedom. Yet even in 1944, even in wartime, they were still considered a problem to be managed. What the army didn't anticipate was England, a country battered by bombs, exhausted by war, but largely indifferent to America's racial codes. Pubs served black soldiers. Streets didn't divide by color. And in one church, a pastor decided that if God's house required segregation, then something was wrong with the rule, not the worshippers. That single refusal rippled outward, through military camps, through whispered conversations, through men who would carry the memory home to a country that would tell them again where they belonged. This is not a story about loud defiance or heroic speeches. It's about a quiet line drawn in a place no one expected, and how that line exposed a contradiction America has never fully resolved. If segregation could be denied in a wartime English church, the question that still haunts history is simple. Why did it survive so easily everywhere else? By 1944, the United States Army was the largest military force the world had ever seen, and it was also one of the most rigidly segregated institutions in modern history. Black Americans were drafted and enlisted in huge numbers, yet from the moment they put on a uniform, they were placed into a system that treated them as both essential and inferior. Training camps across the American South enforced Jim Crow without hesitation. Barracks were separated, mess halls were divided, white officers commanded black units, and the promise that service might earn equality remained deliberately vague. The war demanded manpower, but it did not demand justice. Most black soldiers were assigned to support roles: truck drivers, dock workers, engineers, ammunition handlers. They built roads, unloaded ships, moved fuel and food across continents, doing the labor that made victory possible while rarely receiving credit for it. The army insisted this arrangement was practical, not prejudiced, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Combat was white, labor was black, even blood was segregated, with plasma labeled by race, despite medical evidence proving the distinction meaningless. When American forces began arriving in Britain in 1942, they brought this system with them. Military planners assumed segregation would be enforced overseas exactly as it was at home. Separate Red Cross clubs were established. Military police were instructed to prevent incidents, a word that almost always meant white discomfort. British civilians, however, had not been briefed on America's racial etiquette. They had their own class divisions, their own hierarchies, but skin color did not dictate who could sit, drink, worship, or walk where. This cultural collision created constant tension. Black soldiers found themselves treated as ordinary, men by civilians and as dangerous, variables by their own commanders. White officers grew anxious. Complaints mounted. Memos circulated warning that fraternization could undermine discipline. By the spring of 1944, as preparations for D-Day accelerated, the U.S. Army was fighting two battles in Britain, one against Nazi Germany, and another against the possibility that segregation, once exposed as optional, might stop working at all. At the center of this story were three men, whose lives had been shaped by very different systems of authority. The first was Private First Class James Carter, a 23-year-old supply truck driver from Montgomery, Alabama. Carter had grown up learning rules that were never written down, but always enforced. He knew when to step aside on a sidewalk, when to lower his eyes, when silence was safer than truth. His grandmother had been born enslaved, his parents raised under Jim Crow, and by the time he put on an army uniform in 1943, obedience was second nature. Service, he hoped, might change how the world saw him, even if it did not change the world itself. The second was Captain William Harper, a white American officer assigned to a nearby logistics command. Harper was not a cartoon villain. He was efficient, disciplined, and deeply invested in order. To him, segregation was not hatred but policy, a necessary structure to prevent unrest among white troops. He had been trained to believe that mixing races created instability, and instability in wartime was unacceptable. When he saw black soldiers seated freely in an English church, he did not see worship. He saw a threat to military discipline. The third was Reverend Thomas Wilkins, the Anglican pastor of St. Mary's Church, a stone parish that had stood since the 1300s. Wilkins had lived through the First World War, buried sons of the town, and watched bombs fall during the Blitz. He was reserved, methodical, and deeply committed to the idea that faith was meaningless if it bent to power. He had no interest in American racial politics, but he understood injustice when it stood in front of him. When confronted with a demand that contradicted the gospel he preached, Wilkins made a decision that would quietly defy an empire. By early June 1944, tension around American bases in southern England had reached a breaking point. Black soldiers were being welcomed into English homes, pubs, and churches, while white American officers scrambled to reassert boundaries that no longer seemed enforceable. Reports of incidents multiplied. Dances ended in military police escorts. Clubs were quietly reclassified. Orders were issued reminding commanders to maintain racial discipline, though no one could quite explain how to impose Jim Crow on a country that did not recognize it. Whispers began moving through the camps. Certain pubs would serve anyone. Certain towns were safe. Certain churches asked no questions. For black soldiers accustomed to constant calculation, these rumors carried both promise and danger. Every small freedom felt provisional, every public interaction shadowed by the knowledge that it could be revoked without warning. Still, men kept going into town, kept testing the edges of a world that treated them differently. The church at St. Mary's became one of those spaces. Soldiers attended quietly at first, sitting where they chose, blending into the pews without announcement. Nothing happened. No protests, no violence. That absence itself was unsettling. Officers noticed. Questions were asked. Who had authorized this? Why hadn't it been stopped? On the morning of June 11, 1944, just days after D-Day, Captain Harper entered the church as the congregation gathered. He saw black soldiers seated among civilians and white troops. He did not hesitate. He approached the pastor before the service, began and issued his expectation clearly. Separate seating, American policy, non-negotiable. What Harper did not realize was that the pastor had already decided. The refusal came without raised voices or spectacle, a simple statement of principle. The church was open to all. There would be no segregation here. As the service began, Harper stood rigid in the aisle, calculating consequences. Reporting the pastor could shut the church down. Pushing further could provoke scandal. And as hymns filled the space, he faced an unsettling truth. The longer the soldiers remained seated, the weaker his authority became. The truth that emerged in the weeks after was more disturbing than any single confrontation. The U.S. Army had never intended to fight segregation overseas by accident. Internal memos later uncovered showed that commanders were fully aware that British civilians rejected American racial customs. Rather than adapt, the Army chose containment. Black soldiers were monitored. Military police were instructed to intervene early and decisively. Responsibility for avoiding conflict was placed not on white aggression, but on black visibility. In cases where white soldiers objected to integration, the solution was removal. Black men were escorted out of dances they had not disrupted, barred from clubs where they had caused no trouble. and disciplined for behavior that would have gone unnoticed in white units. The official justification was morale. The unspoken truth was fear. Fear that equality, once experienced, could not be unlearned. What made the church incident dangerous was not defiance, but exposure. For the first time, segregation appeared optional. An English pastor had refused to comply, and the army had failed to punish him. No court-martial followed. No orders shut the church down. Higher command recognized the optics. Forcing segregation inside a British parish risked international embarrassment at a moment when American propaganda centered on freedom and moral superiority. The revelations spread quietly through black units. If segregation could be challenged here, it could be challenged elsewhere. The army understood this. Surveillance increased. Informal warnings circulated. Men were reminded of consequences without specifics. Allowing fear to do the work, policy could not. The deeper truth was this: the army was not protecting discipline. It was protecting a racial order so fragile that a single, unmoved pastor in a stone church threatened to crack it open. And once black soldiers saw that refusal was possible, the war for control over their expectations had already begun. The consequences unfolded slowly, not with headlines or official statements, but in the daily lives of the men who had witnessed the refusal. Black soldiers continued to attend St. Mary's Church, sitting where they wished, worshipping without restriction. The army never formally sanctioned it, but it never stopped it either. Silence became policy. Officers avoided the church. Military police were instructed to look elsewhere. What could not be enforced without embarrassment was quietly abandoned. Outside the church, the system tightened. Dances were more heavily monitored. Black soldiers were increasingly steered away from certain towns. Curfews were enforced unevenly. The message was clear. What happened in the church was an exception, not a precedent. But exceptions matter. They lodge in memory. They alter expectations. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, thousands of black soldiers prepared to return home, carrying something more dangerous than combat. Experience, comparison. They had lived, however briefly, in a society where segregation was not automatic, where dignity did not require negotiation, where a man could sit, speak, and worship without permission. That knowledge could not be confiscated at the dock. Back in the United States, reality reasserted itself with brutal efficiency. Buses were segregated, churches returned to balconies and back pews. Veterans were denied benefits promised to them in uniform. Some men swallowed the contrast in silence. Others could not. The quiet certainty that things did not have to be this way began to surface. In conversations, in churches, in organizing meetings. Years later, when the civil rights movement gathered momentum, many of its backbone organizers were veterans, men who had seen another arrangement of the world and refused to believe the American version was inevitable. The pastor's refusal did not end segregation, but it planted a standard, a lived memory of equality. And once that memory existed, every injustice that followed had to answer to it. The moment itself was small. No photographs, no official record, no medal awarded. A pastor said no, an officer walked out, and a church service continued. History often overlooks such moments because they do not announce themselves as turning points. Yet, for the men who were there, that refusal became a measuring stick against which the rest of their lives would be judged. The English pastor did not dismantle segregation. He did not claim heroism. He simply refused to cooperate with something he believed was wrong. And in doing so, he exposed a truth the U.S. Army worked hard to suppress. Segregation survived, not because it was natural or necessary, but because enough people agreed to enforce it. When one man declined, the system hesitated. For black American soldiers, that hesitation mattered. It revealed that dignity was not something granted by law or uniform, but something recognized by choice. They returned home to a country unwilling to make that choice, yet the memory remained. It shaped how they raised their children, how they understood injustice, how they responded when the civil rights movement asked them to stand again. This story forces an uncomfortable question. If segregation could be challenged in a foreign church during wartime, Why did it endure so long in the nation that claimed to be fighting for freedom? The answer is not about ignorance. It is about convenience, fear, and power. History is often changed not by dramatic revolutions, but by quiet refusals that prove other arrangements are possible. That church in England did not change the world, but it changed how the world could be imagined. And imagination, once awakened, is difficult to suppress. If you found this story unsettling, it should be. Share your thoughts in the comments. What state are you watching from? And ask yourself this: how many injustices survive today not because they must, but because too few people refuse to cooperate with them?